Well, thank you all for tuning in today. We have a special episode with literature and robes with Jared.
This just keeps getting better and better.
Let's start this off by just saying, if you're not sure who Stephen King is,
where have you bloody been?
I would say that it would be a good idea to go out and pick up something of his, maybe even something from my selection back there. Those are a few of the books that I have. There are many Stephen King novels that have been written, as I'm sure many folks already know. So many of them become movies or TV shows. They just attract people. They attract Hollywood.
Everybody wants to be star. You have to be the best. And never give up.
However, they don't always attract literary critics. Some types of genres get dinged for not being literary pieces of art because of the genre, aka fantasy or sometimes sci-fi. Some forms of fiction and horror inevitably sometimes gets walked over as well. As far as literary prose, talent, and the ability to tell a great story no matter what the subject matter is, I gotta say, Stephen King is
at the top, Jack.
Doesn't even matter really if you're not into the subject matter. His voice just comes through so clearly on the page. Something about his writing style taps into the zeitgeist. It taps into what the American experience is, and he writes about it like it is an effortless task of his. However, with the book we're reviewing today, that took 4 years of his life to make the story. This big guy is 1,143 pages of fun, nightmares, and craziness. And I loved every bit of it. I didn't even feel like it was 1,143 pages. It's just, Stephen King's style just pulls you in. You feel like maybe you have a little bit of a doubt in your mind that, oh my gosh, I have so much to read. But once you're in it, once you're in the pages, that book reads quicker than some 400 and 500 page books that I've read before. It just grabs you and doesn't let you go. In terms of the literature, no matter what he's really talking about, Stephen King just has a way of immersing you right into his world, getting you to know his characters as if you've known them for a long time. And this book, as you know, is kind of a coming of age and then a modern telling of where we are right now. There's been 2 movies that have attempted to kind of tell this story, and as far as I know, they get to the main points, but they don't touch on everything, and sometimes that's for good reason, because there's a couple spots in this book that are disturbing for good reason, but I'll get into that a little bit later. But suffice it to say, in my opinion, this is Stephen King's opus, one of his greatest books, maybe second to The Stand. I've heard a lot of people have talked a lot about The Stand, and so you know what? I went out and got that. And it is unfortunately only a couple pages more, I think. That's probably the biggest book that he has written, but I can't wait to get into that one. This being a big guy like it is, it took me almost 2.5 weeks to read this thing, so it took some time. And that's one thing you need to know when you're getting into this book, is that it's going to take you some time. This book is a big beefcake.
I'm not fat. I'm big boned.
A lot of it is what you would see in the movie. There's a lot of that back and forth between modern day and the past, which is back in the 50s when all this started. And in 85, I believe, is where much of the story is told, at least in the modern day, even though this book was published in 86. It's really interesting about the 80s technology and where things were back then that I found as a reader in my 40s to be really nostalgic. There was a mention in there about O.J. Simpson doing a Hertz rental car commercial. Which, as you know, a lot has happened since that time in the 80s. I think he got in trouble in the 90s. They mentioned CD players. They mentioned using telephone cards, which are things that you used to buy, and then you would punch in a bunch of numbers into a payphone and you could talk to somebody long distance or in another country, but you had to use the card to use the phone that was attached to the wall and a phone line to make phone calls long distance.
This little thingamajig here makes a ringing noise like that. There it goes again.
Another thing was like if you were in town, you call an operator and they could give you address, phone number, or whatever, and they would patch you through, or they could get you the phone number and there was like a digital voice that would tell you the phone number. I remember all this stuff when back in the day when phones were trying to improve the technology. What kind of things could they do? And then one of the last things that kind of came through that was dating itself was the fact that they used travel agents to book flights to Derry, Maine. It was really fun for that aspect and go back down this memory lane with Stephen King. It's great. That's probably the warmest part of it. And when you read about the 1950s stuff, even though I was born in the late 70s,
I don't want to hear about it. I don't even want to think about it.
It still feels familiar, like something about the movies we grew up with, the stories that your parents and grandparents would tell, the old pictures from photo albums and families, the things, the cars, the everything that, again, that's something that Stephen King really grasps onto and really makes it stand out, is that American culture piece, music, all that stuff plays a part in these books. He just adds things into it that make the book more of a complete story, more of a complete environment, more complete characters. And as far as that, the characters are amazing. The Losers Club.
This meeting of the Losers Club has officially begun.
You have Bev, you have Richie, you have Stuttering Bill, you have Ben, you have, gosh, I'm sure I'm missing one or two. But yeah, they all have these like unique characteristics. Bill has confidence, but he's also got a stutter, which helps him have to overcome some of these personal challenges in his life. Richie can do accents, which gets edgy because some of the accents that he would do were kind of racy, and take that both ways. Racy as in, oh my gosh, what is he saying? And racism. But back in the 80s, unfortunately, that was kind of a reflection of how people casually made jokes about things like that. Insensitive things were being told in joking environments with friends, you could trust, but at the same time, it was an isolated incident. And nowadays, with how the way technology is, it's not so isolated.
In my culture, I would be well within my rights to dismember you.
It's this little microcosm, this little snapshot Stephen King tells in this It book about a time that used to be where people were a little more off the cuff, and especially it being, young kids, preteens. I can remember having a mouth that should have had soap washing it out on a regular basis, probably.
We should be more fucking accountable for being a shithead dickwad.
I think most people know what this book's about. A clown scaring people. There's nightmarish things happening in a little town of Derry, Maine, which is a lot like the town that Stephen King grew up in, Bangor, I believe. It's got a lot of similarities to his hometown. And in the book, it makes references to other books. Like, this book really gets into the whole Stephen King multiverse, where there's like mentions of other things and other stories. I hear that 11/22/63 has mention of some characters in Derry at the time in 1963, after coming to the sewers in the town and taking kids and killing people and turning everybody crazy. It really deals on a fantastical level. You could almost tie it in with the Dark Tower and whatnot, because Stephen does allow sort of a magic system into this. It's kind of archaic. It's like something from an Aztecian ritualistic voodoo magic almost, which I think is kind of the angle he's going for in this book. It's hard to nail it down, but he has to kind of explain why this thing is here and how it came to be. There can be ways to harness this magic, and you don't have to be the evil creature or whatever to have access to this. A lot of it is just your willpower and the things that you think about and how well you can believe in something to make it true, which in storytelling, that is pretty common.
Says who?
There's mentions of Christine, The Shawshank Redemption. There's just so much stuff that reminds you of Stephen King's other stories. And it's kind of cool in that way too, because you are kind of curious about, well, does that really tie in? It kind of makes you want to read some of his other materials as well. So part of that is why I picked up The Stand and 11/22/63. I do have Pet Sematary back there because that was the last Stephen King book I read since I've read this one, and I did not finish it. I DNF'd it because I got too scared about 2/3 into the book. But I've bought a new copy. I'm an adult now. My imagination doesn't run away with me like it might have had I been younger reading, say, It or Pet Sematary.
Grow the up. You're not children anymore.
It's interesting reading it as an adult. You aren't as scared, but more disturbed. And like I said earlier, part of that is because of some of the subjects, some of the things that happen in there. Some of that stuff makes me cringe. Stephen King really doesn't put many guardrails on his writing in this book. There's a lot of things that happen. And again, I want to say that he used some of these plot devices, the more difficult ones to swallow, to advance the story. The story was disturbing. It was gonna be disturbing anyway. However, the characters do have a way to get through this and find some optimistic, positive side out the other end of the story. Unlike what I've heard about Pet Sematary, where just a whole bunch of bad stuff just happens all the time and there's really no silver lining, which is kind of what I remember of it. But anyway, so yeah, there's racism, there's a lot of abuse, verbal, physical, and sexual. There were just a few things that I was just like, oh wow, what are we doing? Why are you doing this? But again, I kind of tried to rationalize it. I think part of what brings them to where they are in the 80s has something to do with what happened back in the 50s. If you read the book, great, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It was kind of like, whoa, that was tough to get through. I mean, I guess, I don't know. I feel like maybe he didn't need to, but maybe he did. I don't know, God. Because there is a lot of tension.
What tension? There's tension?
We as readers know we wouldn't do that. Why are they doing it? What is going on? Why would you do that? Why would you go upstairs when you're running away from something when the back door is right there that leads out of the house? Stephen King has given himself enough breathing room in terms of the way he writes and how well he writes that this is just kind of the way his mind works. And he's not going to shy away from certain subject matter just to be nice to the reader. I think Stephen does everyone a service by showing us the ugly in society, showing us the ugly in ourselves and each other, and the potential for such ugly behavior. And that being good and altruistic is really comes down to a choice. And that's what the Losers Club definitely always come back to, is protecting each other and being involved in each other's lives, finding that there's more power in a group than there are in an individual. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't terribly scary, but it was disturbing. When I get to the point where I'm going to read Pet Sematary, I'm going to try to see how much more Stephen turns the screws up. I think he gets a lot more dark, a lot more twisted, a lot more, oh, don't go there, oh, don't go there. He went there. So he's challenging everyone.
Challenge accepted.
I definitely recommend picking this up if you have a month to just kind of sit back and read. But this one would take you a little bit of time to do. It took me almost 3 weeks to get through just reading it. So this is going to be 5 out of 5 robes. I mean, come on. This book has been made into two different movies. No, 3, I think. I think they tried to make a TV version of the movie as well. 5 out of 5. Just superb. I don't care that it was a horror, and maybe some literary critics think that shouldn't be given any sort of a serious scoring. But to me, the character work was immaculate. The plot just kept it moving. You're just one thing at a time. He just kept it pacing. You got that. It's like a week's worth or 2 weeks worth of the actual story with all that reminiscing, and it's just fascinating. So that's my favorite word, I think, fascinating.
Interesting.
It was a romping good ride. I love this book. I recommend anyone to read it. It's not too scary. It's a bit of a chunker, but boy, is it entertaining. There's lots of good laughs in it. Some are more tongue-in-cheek. Some make you cringe, but that's where we were at in 1986. So it's kind of an informative little thing about what the 80s were like. So yeah, it was quite a wild time to be alive.
No
But part of that story, I digress, was he kept bringing up the Morlocks, which was in The Time Machine, written by H.G. Wells. And there were a lot of references to it, like the portals that go down into the underground where the Morlocks live, and the fact that Well, I read it. I went out and picked it up and I read it just so I could kind of get a little bit more frame of reference to what Stephen was talking about. This reads kind of like a scientific journal. The beginning was great. The banter back and forth between all these people that the time traveler was trying to talk to and convince about his time machine. He talked about his time traveling far into the future and the expectation that humanity would be great and have all these things and we'd be so smart. We'd have all this technology that we could easily make life so much easier for us when we find out, actually people have become dumber.
Duh.
But the reference to that makes its way into Stephen King's It, and I just kind of wanted to take the time and read it. Didn't take me more than like a day to read this book. Interesting use of words, languages, quips, phrases. They would use a lot of things like by the by. Incontinence was often a mental state rather than a physical state like we would use in the medical world today. That incontinence has a very different definition than it does in that book.
You pooped in your pants.
I pooped my pants.
Sometimes they would use like these dependent clauses, forthwith, or accordingly, I would tell my next sentence as I should. Forthwith, I shall continue to do this book review, and by the by, I am certainly enjoying myself.
Wow, okay.
Things like that. Like, we don't use that in language today. The authors of the 1890s, this was written in 1895, are almost showing off their language skills. That how many big words can I use to describe something? How scientific can I present this? Things like that. So telling a story, but not having a whole lot of character interactions made the story just a read through the mind of H.G. Wells. I think the fear of the dark and the mysterious, the unknown, the dark sea, places where humans don't generally go. So I think that was kind of the appeal of H.G. Wells, is trying to go to a place where it's just not something for humans. We're not built to handle that stuff. And in a way, that message translates into Stephen King's It, because he's definitely trying to scare kids. He dedicated the book to his 3 kids, as a matter of fact. So if I were a kid, this book, it would definitely have scared me a lot. The creepy crawly, the dark, the crawling into a place they don't...
Ugh.
Is the book better than the movies? Yes, I'm going to say that. The first movie, I think the one with Tim Curry? Tim Curry. Gosh, I hope I'm not wrong. The one with him as Pennywise. Thought I heard something. The one with him as Pennywise was entertaining. The story, the coming of age stuff was really good. It was kind of like Goonies horror or something like that. The newer version of it sticks to the story a little bit more. I feel like the pacing of it is a little bit different. It is much longer. They put it into 2 parts. I think the Pennywise in that one was much scarier. Did you hear that? So what do you have left? Read the book. The book is so fantastic. So anyways, yeah, wrap it all up. Probably a 3.5. Again, I don't know. It's one of the classics. It was a classic for a reason, I think, just because the sheer idea of a machine that could take you through time. Ooh. It could only go forward in time, so no back in time, which kind of leaves the creative juices open and flowing. You don't have to rely on research to write a story about the future. 3.5 out of 5 robes. 5.50 out of 5.0 robes, as you already know. I just love Stephen King. He's a nostalgic author. We all kind of grew up with him if you're in your 40s, 50s, and maybe late 30s. So definitely recommend reading his stuff. I think we're gonna... We all float down here. Keep reading.